The great chamber of Orventhal Prime was built to hold thousands, and on this day it did. Representatives from 42 species filled the curved rows of seats that rose like steps around the central speaking platform. The ceiling above them was transparent, showing the cold stars outside the station. It was meant to remind everyone who sat here that they were small, that the universe was large, and that cooperation was the only sane choice. Today, that reminder meant nothing. Ambassador Lysae of the Valesi stood on the central platform. She was small, even by the standards of her own people. Her body was thin and pale, her skin carrying the faint shimmer that all Valesi had, like light trapped just beneath the surface. Her hands trembled as she held the edges of the speaking podium. She had traveled 9 days to reach this station. She had not slept for 3 of them. The Dravani hegemony placed a full military blockade around our homeworld 18 rotations ago, she said. Her voice was steady, but only because she had practiced these words 100 times on the journey here. 340 warships now surround Valesra. No supply vessels may enter, no civilian ships may leave. Our atmospheric generators require fuel shipments every 20 rotations. We have 6 rotations of fuel remaining. After that, the generators will fail, and our atmosphere will begin to collapse. Within 2 rotations of generator failure, the air on the surface will become toxic. Within 4, it will be unbreathable. She paused. She looked around the chamber. Hundreds of eyes and things that served as eyes looked back at her. Some with pity, some with nothing at all. We are not a military species, Lisi continued. We have no warships. We have no weapons. We refuse the Dravani demand for tribute because we believe that the Galactic Concord existed to protect species like ours from exactly this kind of aggression. We believed in the promise of this alliance. That promise is all we have. She took a breath that shook in her chest. I am asking you to honor it. Send ships. Break the blockade. Save my people. We have 6 days. The chamber was quiet for a long moment. Then the talking began, and Lysae felt something cold settle inside her chest, because she knew the sound of people who had already made up their minds. The Karathi spoke first. Their representative was a tall, armored figure named Vorath Ken, and he spoke with the careful, measured tone that the Karathi used when they were about to say no. The Karathi Dominion has deep sympathy for the Valesi people, Vorath Ken said. However, a military intervention against the Dravani hegemony would constitute a direct act of war. The Dravani maintain a fleet of over 9,000 vessels across their territory. The Karathi Dominion has concluded that the strategic risk of intervention outweighs the potential benefit. We recommend continued diplomatic engagement. Diplomatic engagement. Lisi had heard those words before. They meant letters, strongly worded letters that the Dravani would use to clean their boots. The Orvan spoke next. They were a species of mathematicians, and their representative, a thin creature with 6 eyes, presented the situation as an equation. The cost of military intervention, measured in ships, lives, and economic disruption, was placed on one side. The value of the Valesi homeworld, measured in strategic importance, resource output, and population, was placed on the other. The equation did not balance. The Orvan Calculation Bureau considers the losses acceptable within projected galactic stability models, the representative said, as if it were discussing the weather. Acceptable losses. Lysae gripped the podium harder. Her people were an acceptable loss. The Thessic Collective, a hive mind species that controlled a significant portion of the Concord's trade routes, simply abstained. Their representative sat motionless and said nothing. This was, in its own way, the cruelest response of all. The Thessic were powerful enough to end the blockade with a single trade embargo against the Dravani, and they chose silence instead. One by one, the other species followed. Some expressed sympathy, some expressed regret. A few simply shook their heads or made the equivalent gesture. Nobody offered ships. Nobody offered soldiers. Nobody offered anything except words, and words could not stop a blockade. Lysae stood on the platform and watched her world die in real time, killed not by the Dravani, but by the indifference of every species in this room. In the back of the chamber, far from the central platform, in the cheap seats where minor species were placed, a human sat and watched everything. Commander Jonah Marin was 38 years old. He had brown skin, dark eyes, and the kind of face that did not stand out in a crowd. He wore the plain gray uniform of the United Earth Diplomatic Corps, on it which had no medals on it because Earth had not been a member of the Concord long enough to earn any. 11 years. That was how long humanity had been part of this alliance. They were the newest species in the room, and they were treated accordingly. The other species called humanity a developmental species. It was a polite term. It meant they were considered children. Their fleet was small. Their territory was limited. Their technology, while surprisingly advanced for their age, was generations behind the major powers. They had been given a seat in the Concorde the way a parent might give a child a toy steering wheel. It made them feel included. It did not mean they were driving. Jonah Marin watched the Valesi ambassador stand alone on that platform, and he felt something that he suspected most of the other representatives in this room did not feel. He felt angry, not the hot, burning kind of anger, the cold kind, the kind that settles in the stomach like a stone and does not go away. He opened his communication device. It was a small, flat unit that connected to Earth's relay network, and it could send a message across the galaxy in about 4 minutes. He typed a single sentence and sent it to the United Earth Central Command. They are going to let them die. Then he sat back and waited. The session continued. More species spoke. More species declined. The Valesi ambassador stood on the platform through all of it because she had nowhere else to go and nothing else to do. At some point, Jonah noticed that she had stopped trembling, and there was something worse than fear on her face now. It was the understanding that she was alone. Jonah's device buzzed. He looked down. The response from Earth was not addressed to him. It was a public filing, entered directly into the Concorde's official docket, which meant every species in the chamber received it simultaneously. Jonah read it once, then read it again, and then he leaned back in his seat and let out a breath that he had been holding for longer than he realized. The docket entry was short. It read, "The United Earth Government, acting under Article 7 of the Galactic Concord Charter, hereby dispatches one vessel to the Valesi system for the purpose of humanitarian intervention and blockade interdiction. Vessel designation UES Achilles. Estimated arrival, 4 standard rotations. Mara end of filing." The effect in the chamber was immediate. The Karathi representative turned in his seat and looked toward the human section. The Orvan analyst began pulling data on its screen. The Thesic Collective's representative moved for the first time in hours, tilting its head in what might have been curiosity. The Dravani ambassador, a broad, heavily built figure named Torek San, stood up from his seat. He had been quiet during the entire session, watching the Valesi beg with the satisfied expression of someone who knew the outcome before the game began. Now he looked toward the human section with an expression that was halfway between amusement and disbelief. "One ship," he said, loud enough for the entire chamber to hear. "The humans are sending one ship?" A ripple of sound moved through the chamber. One something between laughter and confusion. Torek San stepped into the aisle so that more of the chamber could see him. He was enjoying this. "My fleet around Valesra numbers 340 warships, 340, and the humans in their great wisdom are sending one." He spread his arms wide. "We expected a fleet. One ship is not a rescue. It is a funeral procession, a very small funeral procession." Several representatives laughed. The Karathi did not laugh, but Vorth Ken shook his head slowly, the way one might at a child who had done something foolish but endearing. The Orvan analyst was typing rapidly on its console. After a moment, it spoke. "Our records show no vessel designated UES Achilles in any publicly available Earth fleet registry, and the designation does not appear in standard Earth naval databases. This is unusual." "Perhaps it is so small they forgot to register it," Torek San said, and more laughter followed. On the central platform, Ambassador Lysay stared at the docket entry on her own screen. One ship, one human ship, coming to help her people while every other species in the galaxy looked away. She did not know whether to feel hope or despair. One ship against 340. The mathematics of it were simple and brutal. She looked toward the human section. Commander Marin met her eyes. He gave her a small nod. It was not a nod that said everything would be fine. It was a nod that said, "We are coming." After the session ended, the representatives filed out through the broad corridors of Orventhal Prime. The station was a city in space, with markets, residences, and parks built into its rotating rings. Jonah Marin walked through one of these corridors and was stopped by Vorth Ken of the Karathi. The Karathi was nearly a full meter taller than Jonah. His species looked something like tall, broad insects wrapped in natural armor, though Jonah knew better than to say that out loud. Vorth Ken looked down at him with compound eyes that glittered under the corridor lights. "Commander Marin," Vorth Ken said, "I wish to speak honestly with you." "Go ahead. Your people have done a brave thing today. Brave, but foolish. One ship cannot break a Dravani blockade. You must know this. Your ship will be destroyed, your crew will die, and the Valesi will still perish. The only difference is that humans will die alongside them." Jonah looked up at the Karathi for a long moment. "You might be right," he said. "Then why do it?" Jonah thought about this question. He thought about all the ways he could answer it. He could talk about strategy, about politics, about the long game of building alliances. All of those things were true in a way, but they were not the real answer. "Because someone had to," he said simply. Vorth Ken stared at him. Among the Karathi, military decisions were made through careful calculation of risk and reward. The idea of sending a single ship into certain destruction because someone had to was not a concept that fit easily into their thinking. "Your species is very strange, Commander," Vorth Ken said finally. "I know," Jonah said. "That's what makes it interesting." He continued walking. Behind him, Vorth Ken stood in the corridor and watched him go. And there was something in his compound eyes that he could not quite name. It was not pity, exactly. It was not admiration. It was closer to the feeling one gets when watching someone walk calmly toward a fire. Later that evening, Jonah sat in his small quarters on Orventhal Prime and received a second message from Earth. This one was private, encrypted, and addressed only to him. It was from Admiral Constance Wu, the head of United Earth Naval Command. The message read, "Jonah, I know what you are thinking. You are thinking that we are sending 4,200 people to their deaths. I want you to know that I thought the same thing when I first read the mission brief. Then I read the file on the Achilles. I have been in the Navy for 31 years, and I have never seen anything like it. I don't know if one ship can break a blockade of 340, but if any ship in the galaxy can do it, it's this one. Trust the ship. Trust the captain. And when the other species ask you what we are doing, smile. Don't explain, just smile." "Ooh." Jonah read the message 3 times. Then he closed it and looked out his small window at the stars. Somewhere out there, in the dark between those stars, a single ship was already moving. It was moving fast. It was moving toward the Valesi system. It was moving toward 340 warships that stood between it and an innocent world. And the rest of the galaxy thought it was a joke. On the Dravani flagship, orbiting high above the Valesi homeworld, Marshal Torek Vane received the report about the human ship with mild amusement. He was a veteran of 11 campaigns, a commander who had broken worlds and shattered fleets. He had earned his rank through blood and fire, and he did not lose sleep over a single ship crewed by a species that had barely learned to travel between stars. "One ship," he said to his aide, setting down the report. "They send one ship. These humans are either very brave or very stupid." "Perhaps both, Marshal," his aide offered. Vane grunted. "Assign a scout wing to intercept. 4 ships should be more than enough. If the humans will not turn back on their own, we will turn them back." "And if they refuse to turn back, Marshal?" Vane looked at his aide with flat, cold eyes. "Nice, then the scout wing will have target practice." He turned back to the viewport and looked down at the Valesi world below. It was a beautiful planet in its way, blue and white, with swirling clouds and crystalline mountain ranges that caught the sunlight. In 6 days, its atmosphere would begin to die, and the Valesi with it. They would surrender long before then. They always did. Every species broke eventually. It was just a matter of pressure and time. A single human ship was not going to change that. It was not going to change anything. He was sure of it. Down on the surface of Valesra, Ambassador Lysi's message reached the Valesi High Council. One ship. The humans were sending one ship. The council members looked at each other with expressions of confusion and fragile, impossible hope. "One ship," said Elder Tasavri, the oldest member of the council. "What can one ship do?" "I do not know," said another council member, But the humans are the only ones who answered. In the silence that followed, a young Valesi child pressed her face against a window and looked up at the sky. She could not see the Dravani ships from the surface, but she knew they were there, circling like predators above the clouds. Her mother had told her that help was coming. She had asked how much help, and her mother had said one ship. One ship sounded very small, but it also sounded like something, and something was better than the nothing that everyone else had offered. The child watched the sky and waited. The galaxy watched and waited. And somewhere in the dark, getting closer with every passing second, the UES Achilles burned through the void like a fist made of steel and fury, carrying 4,200 human beings who had volunteered to fly into the teeth of an empire for people they had never met. Because someone had to. The first thing that anyone noticed about the UES Achilles was that it was ugly. This was not a matter of opinion. It was a fact that even the humans who built it would freely admit. In a galaxy where warships were designed with sweeping curves, balanced proportions, and elegant symmetry, the Achilles looked like it had been built by someone who hated the very concept of beauty. It was dense, asymmetric, and brutal. Its hull was a dark, unpolished gray that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. It had no decorative markings, no flowing lines, no concessions to aesthetics of any kind. It looked less like a ship and more like a weapon that someone had bolted engines onto. The Karathi built warships that looked like blades. The Dravani built warships that looked like armored fists. The Orvan built warships that looked like mathematical proofs given physical form. Humanity built the Achilles and it looked like a promise of violence. Captain Ria Vasquez stood on the bridge of this ugly, magnificent ship and watched the stars streak past on the main display. She was 44 years old with black hair cut short, brown skin, and eyes that had the flat, calm quality of someone who had seen enough to know that panic was a luxury she could not afford. She had a thin scar on her left jaw from a training accident 12 years ago, and she never had it removed because she believed that scars were reminders. And reminders were useful. She had commanded 3 ships before the Achilles, a patrol corvette, a light cruiser, and a destroyer escort. Each one had been a step up. The Achilles was not a step up. It was a leap into something else entirely. When she had first walked its corridors 3 years ago, during the final construction phase, she had felt something that she could only describe as respect. Not for the people who built it, though they deserved it, for the ship itself. It felt alive in a way that her previous commands had not. It felt like it was waiting for something. Now it was moving toward that something at a speed that would make most galactic navigators nervous. "Time to the Valesi system," Vasquez said. "3 rotations, 14 hours, Captain," said Lieutenant Commander David Park, her executive officer. He was a thin man with steady hands and a voice that never rose above a conversational tone, even when things were falling apart around him. Vasquez had chosen him specifically for that quality. "We are currently exceeding standard transit speed by a factor of 1.7. Engine status? Green across the board. Chief Okafor says the drives are running like they are happy to finally stretch their legs." Vasquez almost smiled at that. Chief Engineer Adeze Okafor treated the Achilles engines the way some people treated their children, with fierce love, constant worry, and absolute refusal to let anyone else touch them without permission. "Good," Vasquez said. "Assemble the senior staff in the briefing room. Full mission brief in 30 minutes. The briefing room of the Achilles was a plain, a gray space with a large table in the center and a holographic display built into its surface. 12 officers sat around it. Vasquez stood at the head and activated the display. The Valesi system appeared in blue light above the table, with 340 red markers arranged in 3 concentric rings around the planet Valesra. "This is what we are flying into," Vasquez said. 340 Dravani warships in a standard 3-layer blockade formation. Outer ring is their light screening force. Cruisers, destroyers, fast attack ships. Their job is to detect and intercept anything coming in. Second ring is their main battle line. Heavy cruisers, battleships, and their carrier group. Third ring, closest to the planet, is their siege line. These are the ships with the weapons pointed at the surface. If the Valesi try anything, these are the ships that will shoot. She let the image rotate slowly so everyone could see the full picture. "We are one ship," she continued, I will not insult your intelligence by pretending that those numbers are not a problem. They are. But numbers are not the only thing that matters in a fight, and this ship was built for exactly this kind of situation. She tapped the display, and the image of the Dravani fleet was replaced by a detailed diagram of the Achilles itself. The officers looked at it with the quiet pride of people who knew their ship well, but never got tired of seeing what it could do. For those of you who are new to this crew, let me explain what you are serving on, Vasquez said. The UES Achilles is the first and currently only siege-class dreadnought in the United Earth Navy. It was designed and built under Project Midnight, a black tier development program that began 14 years ago, 3 years before humanity even joined the Galactic Concord. She paused to let that sink in. The Concord thinks we are a developmental species. They think we have a small fleet of mid-range warships and a handful of patrol ships. They are correct. That is our public fleet. The Achilles is not part of our public fleet. The Achilles was built in a classified shipyard in the asteroid belt behind Jupiter. And until 48 hours ago, no species outside of humanity knew it existed. Lieutenant Commander Park spoke up. Captain, if I may, the question on everyone's mind is going to be the same one. One ship against 340. What makes us think we can do this? Vasquez nodded. She had expected the question, and she respected Park for asking it directly rather than letting it sit unspoken. The answer is doctrine, she said. Every other navy in the galaxy is built on the same basic principle. Ships fight in fleets. You win battles by having more ships, or better positioning. The major powers build their navies around fleet engagements because that is how wars between large powers are fought. She brought up a new image on the display. It was a simple text document titled Doctrine Singular Force Projection. Humanity looked at the galaxy and asked a different question, Vasquez said. Not how do we win a fleet battle. We asked, what if we cannot bring a fleet? What if we are alone? What if we have to fight everyone at once with nothing but what we brought with us? The Achilles is the answer to that question. It is not a fleet ship, it is a fleet replacement. She began walking through the ship's systems, and with each one she described, the room grew a little quieter. The hull was not standard armor. It was an adaptive composite that contained billions of microscopic sensors and reactive elements. When struck by a weapon, the hull analyzed the energy type, frequency, and impact pattern, and then physically restructured itself at the point of impact to better resist that specific type of damage. The more you shot at it, the harder it became to hurt. No two impacts would do the same amount of damage because the hull learned from each one. The weapons were extensive. The Achilles carried more firepower than most species put on an entire battle group. Beam arrays, missile batteries, point defense networks, and close-range plasma projectors lined its hull like teeth. But the centerpiece was the spinal mount kinetic accelerator, a weapon that ran the entire length of the ship's central axis. The crew called it the Fist of God, and the name was not an exaggeration. It accelerated a dense projectile to a significant fraction of light speed and fired it in a straight line. The impact energy was measured in numbers that made weapons engineers go quiet and stare at their calculations for a long time. Then there were the drones. The Achilles carried 4,000 autonomous strike craft in internal bays. They were small, fast, and vicious, each one carrying enough weaponry to threaten a ship many times its size. They operated independently or in swarms, and they were controlled by the ship's central AI. That AI was called Phalanx. Vasquez brought up the AI status display on the holographic table. Unlike most ship systems, which were represented by green status indicators, Phalanx was represented by a slowly pulsing blue circle. It looked almost like a heartbeat. Phalanx is not a standard ship AI, Vasquez said. Most ship A is handle navigation, communications, and basic system management. Phalanx does all of that, but its primary function is combat management. It processes tactical information in what the engineers call combat time, which means it thinks and reacts at a speed that is functionally instantaneous by human standards. In a fight, Phalanx will coordinate our weapons, our drones, our defenses, and our maneuvering simultaneously across hundreds of individual targets. It does not panic. It does not get confused. When it does not get tired. A voice came from the room's speakers. It was calm, measured, and had a quality that was difficult to describe. It sounded like a person, but a person who had never once in their life felt uncertain about anything. "I appreciate the introduction, Captain," Failing said. "I should note, for the benefit of the crew, that I have already begun analyzing the Dravani blockade formation based on available intelligence data. I have identified 17 structural weaknesses in their defensive geometry and have developed 43 engagement scenarios ranked by probability of success. Would you like me to present them?" "Not yet," Vasquez said. "We will go over scenarios after the brief. For now, hold." "Understood. Standing by." Vasquez looked around the table at her officers. She saw 12 faces looking back at her. Some were nervous, some were excited. All of them were paying very close attention. "Our mission orders are clear," she said. "Break the blockade, protect the Valesi. Do not fire first, but if fired upon, leave nothing that can follow us home." She let those words hang in the air. "We are going to be outnumbered 340 to 1. We are going to be surrounded. We are going to take damage, and some of us may not come back. I will not promise you that everyone survives this, but I will promise you this. That ship out there, the one we are standing inside right now, was built for this moment. Every plate of armor, every weapon, every line of code in Phalanx's systems, it was all built for the day when humanity would have to stand alone against impossible odds and refuse to back down." She straightened up. "We are that day. Dismissed." The officers filed out. Park stayed behind as he always did. "Captain," he said quietly, "do you believe we can do this?" Vasquez looked at the holographic display, still showing the 340 red markers around the Valesi homeworld. "I believe we are going to try," she said, "and I believe this ship will not let us down." "That is not exactly the same thing as saying yes." "No," Vasquez agreed, "it is not." Far away in the intelligence division of the Karathi Dominion, an analyst named Sarath Voss sat in a dark room filled with screens and tried to understand what she was looking at. Sarath was very good at her job. She had been tracking human military development for 6 years, and she had assembled a detailed picture of their navy. Every ship class, every base, every patrol route. The humans were not particularly secretive, at least not compared to some species. Their fleet was modest, their technology was respectable but not remarkable, and their strategic position in the galaxy was minor. They were, in Sarath's professional assessment, a mid-tier developing power that would need another 50 years before they became truly relevant, and then the Achilles appeared, and everything she thought she knew fell apart. She had pulled every database, every signal intercept, every scrap of information she could find about the ship. The result was almost nothing. The hull number existed in Earth's naval registry, but it was flagged with a classification level that Sarath had never seen before. There were no specifications, no construction records, no crew manifests, no sensor profiles, nothing. In the intelligence world, that absence of information was itself information. It meant the humans had spent enormous effort hiding this ship. Species did not spend that kind of effort on things that did not matter. She pulled up the only visual data she had, a long-range sensor image captured by a Karathi observation satellite near the human transit corridor. The image was grainy and distorted by distance, but the basic shape of the Achilles was visible. Sarath stared at it for a long time. She had studied warship design across dozens of species. She could identify a ship's purpose by its shape the way a biologist could identify an animal's diet by its teeth. Escort ships were sleek. Carriers were broad. Patrol ships were light. The Achilles was none of these things. It was dense in a way that suggested extreme armor. It was asymmetric in a way that suggested it was designed for forward assault rather than fleet formation. And it was large. Not the largest ship she had ever seen, but large enough that its mass readings were concerning. She ran a comparison against known ship classes in the galaxy. Nothing matched. The Achilles did not fit into any existing category. That scared her more than anything else. She wrote a report and sent it to the Karathi Military Command. The report said in careful language, and that the humans appeared to possess a warship of unknown class and unknown capability, that this warship had been deliberately hidden from the galactic community, and that the Kirathi should pay very close attention to what happened next. The report ended with a single recommendation: do not assume the outcome of this engagement. On the Dravani flagship, Marshal Torek Vane had assigned a scout wing to intercept the Achilles. 4 fast cruisers under the command of Wing Commander Draven Koss, a young officer who was hungry for advancement and eager to prove himself. Vane had chosen him because the task was simple: intercept one ship, order it to turn around, and destroy it if it refused. It did not require experience, it barely required attention. Koss took his 4 ships and positioned them along the Achilles' projected transit path. They dropped out of faster-than-light travel and waited in the dark between stars. 4 Dravani cruisers, each one carrying enough firepower to level a small city. More than enough for one ship. The Achilles appeared on their sensors 30 minutes later. It dropped out of transit at the edge of the system, decelerating with a burst of energy that was, Koss noted, unusually large for a single vessel. He opened a communication channel. Unidentified human vessel. This is Wing Commander Draven Koss of the Dravani hegemony. You are approaching a restricted military zone. You will reverse course immediately or be engaged with lethal force. You have 60 seconds to comply. He leaned back in his chair and waited. He expected the human ship to either turn around or begin transmitting panicked diplomatic protests. That was what ships did when they were outnumbered and outgunned. The Achilles did neither. It continued forward. Same speed, same heading, directly toward the 4 Dravani cruisers. On the bridge of the Achilles, Vasquez stood with her hands clasped behind her back and watched the 4 red markers on her tactical display. They were arranged in a loose line ahead, blocking the transit path. Phalanx, she said. Status. The AI responded instantly. 4 Dravani light cruisers, Varric class. I have identified, targeted, and solution-locked all 4 vessels. Their shields are at standard power. Their weapons are charged but not aimed. Whilst their formation is tactically poor, they are too close together and too far from mutual support range. If hostilities begin, I can disable all 4 ships in 11.3 seconds. Park glanced at the captain. 11 seconds? 11.3, Phalanx corrected. I rounded down for simplicity. The actual calculation is 11.287 seconds, assuming they do not take evasive action immediately, which based on Dravani reaction time data, they will not. The communication channel crackled. Koss's voice came through again, sharper now. Human vessel, you have 30 seconds to comply. This is your final warning. Vasquez opened her channel. Her voice was calm and clear. Wing Commander Koss, this is Captain Ria Vasquez of the United Earthship Achilles. I am proceeding to the Valesi system under Article 7 of the Galactic Concord Charter, which authorizes humanitarian intervention in cases of unlawful siege. You may step aside or you may stay where you are, but I want you to understand something clearly before you make that decision. She paused. Just long enough. You have one chance to move. There was silence on the channel. On the bridge of his cruiser, Koss stared at his sensor display. The human ship was still coming. It had not slowed down. It had not deviated. And something on his sensor readout was bothering him. The energy output of the human vessel was higher than it should have been. Much higher. His sensors could not get a clear reading on its weapon systems, which meant either its weapons were inactive or its hull was blocking the scan. He was not sure which possibility was worse. His hand hovered over the weapons console. 4 cruisers against 1 ship. The math was clear, and yet something in the human captain's voice gave him a feeling that he did not like. It was the voice of someone who was not bluffing, not because they were brave, but because they did not need to bluff. Wing Commander, his sensor officer said quietly, I am reading. I do not know what I am reading. The energy signature on that ship does not match anything in our database. Koss looked at his display one more time. The Achilles filled his sensor screen like a dark storm. It was close enough now that he could see it on visual. A massive, ugly shape against the stars, moving with the steady, unstoppable momentum of something that had already decided how this was going to end. When he made a decision, it was, he would later reflect, the smartest decision of his career. All ships, Koss said, clear the transit lane. Let them through. His second-in-command turned to him with shock on his face. Wing Commander, our orders. Our orders were to intercept one ship. That, he pointed at the Achilles on the display, is not just a ship. I do not know what it is, but I am not going to find out with 4 cruisers. The Dravani scout wing moved aside. The Achilles passed through the gap without slowing down, without acknowledging, without a single additional word. It continued on its course toward the Valesi system, toward 340 warships, toward the fight that was waiting for it. On the bridge, Vasquez let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. Good, she said quietly. She knew that was the easy part. Captain, Failing said, I should note that Wing Commander Koss displayed an unusual level of tactical awareness for a junior Dravani officer. He recognized the threat and withdrew rather than engaging. This suggests that the Dravani officers we will face at the blockade may not all be as reckless as command assumes. Noted, Vasquez said, but we are still going. Of course, Captain. I merely wish to observe that the enemy may be smarter than expected. This does not change our probability of success by a meaningful amount. I have already adjusted my engagement scenarios accordingly. What is our probability of success, Phalanx? There was a pause. It was the first time Vasquez had ever heard the AI pause before answering a question. That depends on how you define success, Captain, Phalanx said. Probability of success means breaking the blockade and protecting the Valesi. I calculate a 67% probability. If success means doing that and bringing this ship home, the number is lower. How much lower? I would prefer not to say at this time, Captain. It may affect crew morale. Vasquez looked at the main display. The Valesi system was getting closer. The red markers of the Dravani fleet were getting brighter. Fair enough, she said. Let's go save a world. The Achilles burned onward through the dark, and the galaxy held its breath. The Achilles dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Valesi system, and every sensor in the Dravani blockade fleet lit up at once. 340 warships, they hung in the blackness of space around the planet Valesra like a cage made of metal and fire. The outer ring was the widest, a loose net of fast cruisers and destroyer screens spread across millions of kilometers of space. The second ring was tighter, packed with heavy cruisers, battleships, and the fleet's carrier group. The third ring, closest to the planet, was the siege line. The ships with their weapons aimed downward, ready to burn the surface if the Valesi stepped out of line. It was, by any standard, an overwhelming display of military power. The kind of force that made species surrender before the first shot was fired. The kind of force that said, you have already lost, and the only question is how much you want to suffer before you accept it. Into this cage of steel and fury came one ship, which the Achilles decelerated with a flare of energy that the Dravani sensors read as a small sun appearing at the edge of their detection range. It came to a relative stop and hung there, alone, in the vast emptiness between the system's outer planets and the blockade formation, a single dark shape against the stars. On the bridge of the Dravani flagship, Marshal Torek Vane stood before the main display and looked at the lone contact with an expression that was close to amusement. He was a large man, even by Dravani standards, with heavy shoulders and a face that carried the marks of a dozen campaigns. His uniform was decorated with the campaign ribbons of 11 victories, each one representing a species that had tried to resist the hegemony and failed. So, Vane said, the humans actually came. Yes, on Marshall, his tactical officer confirmed. Single vessel, large, unknown class. Energy signature is significant. Significant how? The tactical officer hesitated. Its power output is higher than our flagship, Marshal. Vane turned to look at him. One ship has a higher power output than the largest warship in this fleet? Yes, Marshal. Considerably higher. Vane was quiet for a moment. Then he turned back to the display. He was not the kind of man who was easily unsettled, but he filed that information away in the part of his mind that kept track of things that did not fit the expected pattern. Still, one ship. Whatever its power output, it was one ship against 340. The mathematics of war were not complicated. Mass and numbers won battles. They always had. They always would. Well, he opened a system-wide broadcast channel. This would be heard by every ship in his fleet, by the Valesi on the surface, and by the Galactic Concord observers who he knew were monitoring from long range. "Human vessel," Vane said, his voice filling the communication frequencies with the deep, resonant authority of a man who had never lost a battle. "This is High Marshal Torek Vane of the Dravani Hegemony. You have entered a restricted military zone. You are outnumbered, outgunned, and alone. I recognize your bravery for what it is worth, but bravery without numbers is just a slower form of suicide. Turn around now, and I will allow you to leave with your ship and your dignity intact. Stay, and I will destroy you. You have 5 minutes to decide." He closed the channel and clasped his hands behind his back. How he expected the human ship to turn around. Bravery was one thing, stupidity was another. No sane commander would stay. The response came in less than 30 seconds. Captain Ria Vasquez's voice filled the bridge of the Dravani flagship, and every other bridge in the fleet, in the surface of Valesra, and the observation posts of 12 species watching from the edges of the system. Her voice was calm. Not the calm of someone who was afraid and hiding it. The calm of someone who had made peace with what was about to happen and had decided to move forward anyway. "Marshal Vane, I am Captain Ria Vasquez of the United Earthship Achilles. I am here to inform you that the blockade of the Valesi homeworld is over. You may withdraw your ships with honor, and no blood will be shed, or you may stay. And you will learn why humanity only needed to send one ship." She paused. When she spoke again, her voice carried an edge that had not been there before. "The choice is yours, but I want you to understand that it is a choice you will only get to make once. Choose carefully." On the Dravani flagship, the silence that followed was heavy. Vane's officers looked at each other. A few of them looked uncomfortable. Most of them looked angry. The Dravani were not a species that responded well to being told what to do by anyone, least of all by a single ship from a species they considered barely worth noticing. Vane's jaw tightened. He had offered mercy. The humans had thrown it back in his face. "Outer ring," he said. "Engage!" 80 warships surged forward. They came from every direction, closing the distance between the outer screening ring and the Achilles in a coordinated rush. Cruisers and destroyers, fast and well-armed, each one carrying enough firepower to reduce a small moon to rubble. They fanned out as they closed in, forming a sphere of death around the lone human ship. And when they reached weapons range, they opened fire. The first volley hit the Achilles like a storm. Beam weapons, plasma bolts, kinetic rounds, and guided missiles converged on the single target from 80 different angles. The space around the Achilles turned white with the light of impacts. Energy splashed across its hull. Explosions bloomed against its surface. From a distance, it looked like the ship was being consumed by fire. On the bridges of every Dravani ship in the outer ring, the weapon officers waited for the kill confirmation. They expected the human ship to break apart, to vent atmosphere, to die the way every ship died when hit by that much concentrated firepower. The fire cleared. The Achilles was still there. It had not moved. It had not tried to dodge or evade. It had simply taken the full force of 80 warships firing at once and remained where it was, hanging in space like a dark monument to stubbornness. On its hull, the adaptive armor was doing what it had been designed to do. Each impact was analyzed in microseconds. Energy type, frequency, intensity, angle. Every variable was measured, processed, and fed into the hull's restructuring algorithms. The billions of reactive elements in the armor shifted, hardened, and reorganized themselves. Where the first volley had scorched and pitted the hull, the second volley did less. When the third volley did less than that, the Dravani were shooting at a ship that was learning from their fire, and they did not know it yet. On the bridge of the Achilles, the world was noise and motion. The ship shuddered with each impact. Status displays flickered. Warning indicators flashed yellow and orange across the tactical screens. "Hull integrity at 93%, Phalanx reported, its voice unchanged by the chaos around it. "Adaptive plating is responding well. I have cataloged 7 distinct Dravani weapon types and have optimized hull response for all 7. Incoming damage efficiency has dropped by 41% since the initial volley. They will need to hit us significantly harder to cause meaningful damage." "Good," Vasquez said. She gripped the arms of her command chair as another volley rocked the ship. Phalanx, target the outer ring. Weapons free. With pleasure, Captain. The Achilles came alive. Along its flanks, weapon ports that had been sealed and dark since the ship's arrival suddenly opened. Beam arrays locked onto targets with a precision that the Dravani had never seen from any species. Each beam found its mark, not the center of mass, where shields were strongest, but the specific weak points in each ship's design, where armor was thinnest, where power conduits ran close to the surface, where shield emitters were most vulnerable. Phalanx was not firing blindly. It was performing surgery. 12 Dravani ships lost their engines in the first 8 seconds. Their drives simply died, cut apart by beams that found the exact junction where the engine housing met the hull. 6 more lost their weapons arrays. The beam projectors on their flanks sliced off as cleanly as if they had been removed by a surgeon's blade. Missiles streaked out from the Achilles batteries in coordinated swarms, each one finding a different target, each one hitting a different system. And then the drone bays opened. 4,000 autonomous strike craft poured out of the Achilles like a swarm of hornets from a nest that someone had been foolish enough to kick. They were small, each one no larger than a shuttle, but they moved with a speed and coordination that was terrifying to watch. They did not fly in formation. They flew in swarms, each swarm moving as a single organism, flowing around defensive fire, splitting and reforming, hitting targets from angles that the Dravani point defense systems could not track. The outer ring fell into chaos. So ships that had been firing confidently moments ago were now spinning, burning, desperately trying to track thousands of targets while the Achilles itself continued to advance, its beam arrays carving through the formation like a blade through paper. The Concorde observers, watching from their long-range sensor posts at the edge of the system, saw the battle unfold on their displays. In the observation chamber on Orventhal Prime, representatives from a dozen species watched in stunned silence. The Karathi military attaché, a grizzled old soldier named Torvan, stood up from his chair without realizing he had done it. He had fought in wars. He had seen fleet engagements. He had never seen anything like this. One ship was dismantling 80 warships, and it was doing it with a systematic efficiency that made his combat instincts scream. The Orvan analyst beside him was typing frantically on a console, running calculations, trying to make the numbers fit into its models. The numbers refused. "That is not possible," the analyst said. "The damage output of that single vessel exceeds the combined output of a Karathi assault squadron. The drone coordination is operating at a level of tactical complexity that should require a fleet command network, not a single-ship AI. The adaptive hull plating is negating incoming fire at a rate that our models say is theoretically impossible. This is not possible. And yet," Torvan said quietly, "it is happening." Back in the Valesi system, the outer ring was broken. In less than 15 minutes, the Achilles and its drone swarms had destroyed or disabled 31 ships and forced the rest to scatter. The wreckage of Dravani cruisers and destroyers tumbled through space in slow-burning spirals. The Achilles did not pause to admire its work. It advanced. On the Dravani flagship, Marshal Vane watched the destruction of his outer ring with an expression that had gone from disbelief to cold, focused fury. He had underestimated the humans. He could admit that to himself. He would not make the same mistake twice. "Second ring," as he ordered. "Full engagement, all ships. I want that thing surrounded and destroyed." The main battle line moved. Heavy cruisers, battleships, and the fleet's 2 carriers turned their bows toward the approaching Achilles and began to close. These were not the light screening ships of the outer ring. These were the heavy hitters, the ships that cracked fortresses and broke fleets. When each one carried weapons that could damage a planetary surface from orbit. 160 ships, the core of the Dravani fleet, moving as one. Vasquez watched them come on her tactical display. 160 capital ships forming a closing wall of metal and firepower. "Phalanx," she said. "Spinal mount status." "Charged and ready, Captain." "Target? Open space. Coordinates right between their second and third rings. I do not want to hit any ships. I want to hit nothing at all." Park looked at her. "Captain?" "Trust me," Vasquez said. "Phalanx, fire the spinal mount." "Firing!" The fist of God spoke. The entire ship shuddered as the spinal mount kinetic accelerator discharged. a projectile roughly the size of a ground car, made from the densest material human engineering could produce. It left the ship's central axis at a velocity that was difficult to comprehend. It crossed the distance between the Achilles and the target coordinates in less than 2 seconds. It hit nothing. That was the point. When the projectile reached the empty space between the second and third rings, it detonated. Not in an explosion of fire and heat, but in a release of kinetic energy so massive that it created a shock wave in the fabric of space itself. The wave expanded outward at tremendous speed, and when it hit the Dravani ships, it did not damage them. It moved them. Capital ships weighing millions of tons were physically shoved aside. The carefully maintained formation geometry of the blockade shattered like glass. Ships that had been precisely positioned to create overlapping fields of fire were suddenly tumbling, their engines firing desperately to regain orientation, their formations broken. The gap between the second and third rings, which had been a wall of coordinated firepower, was now a chaotic mess of displaced ships trying to find their positions. Vasquez pointed at the gap. "Through there, full speed." The Achilles surged forward. Its engines burned at maximum power, driving the massive ship toward the gap in the Dravani formation like a battering ram. Dravani ships fired on it as it passed, but their shots were poorly aimed, fired from ships that were still reorienting, still trying to understand what had just happened. A Dravani destroyer, spinning from the shockwave, found itself directly in the Achilles' path. It tried to move. It was too slow. The Achilles hit it, not with a weapon, with itself. The forward hull of the Achilles, armored and dense and moving at a speed that no ship that size should have been moving at, struck the destroyer amidships. The smaller ship crumpled like a tin can hit by a hammer. The Achilles pushed through the wreckage without slowing down, using the debris as a shield against incoming fire from the ships on either side. It was brutal. It was ugly. It was not the way wars were supposed to be fought. It was the way humans fought when they were outnumbered and had no choice. The conquered observers watched in silence. Several of them had stopped trying to analyze what they were seeing and were simply watching with open mouths. Marshal Vane gripped the railing of his command platform hard enough to leave marks in the metal. His second ring was in disarray. The human ship had punched through the gap and was now between his main battle line and his siege line, the worst possible position for his fleet and the best possible position for the enemy. "All ships converge," Vane said. His voice was steady, but the officers on his bridge could hear something in it that they had never heard before. "Strain. Every ship in this fleet, converge on the human vessel. I want it surrounded from every direction. I want so much fire hitting that ship that nothing can survive it. Everything we have. Now." 340 ships. Every ship he had. Every weapon, every fighter, every piece of firepower at his disposal, all converging on a single point in space where one ugly, battered human ship refused to stop moving. On the bridge of the Achilles, the tactical display turned red. Its contacts closing from every direction. The entire Dravani fleet was coming for them. Vasquez looked at the display for a long moment. She thought about her crew. She thought about the Velesi on the surface below, their atmospheric generators counting down toward failure. She thought about the Concorde, watching from safety, having chosen to do nothing. She thought about Earth, billions of people who would not know the outcome of this fight for hours, who had sent their ship and their people into the dark because it was the right thing to do. She took a breath. "Phalanx," she said, and her voice carried the weight of everything she had just thought about. "Protocol Thermopylae." The AI was quiet for exactly 1/2 of 1 second. When it spoke, there was something in its synthetic voice that had not been there before, something that sounded almost like anticipation. "With pleasure, Captain." And the Achilles began to change. Every system on the ship shifted simultaneously. The engines surged past their rated limits, pouring power into the drive systems at a level that the safety protocols would have prevented if those protocols had not just been overridden. The weapons charged to maximum and beyond, capacitors screaming with energy that they were not designed to hold for long. The shields fluctuated, then stabilized at a frequency that Phalanx had calculated in combat time to be optimal against the specific mix of weapons that were about to hit them. The adaptive hull plating accelerated its processing, restructuring faster and faster, trying to stay ahead of the storm that was about to break over them. The crew felt it. Everyone on the ship felt it. The deck plates vibrated. The lights flickered and then burned brighter than normal. The air itself seemed to hum with energy. It felt like the ship was waking up, like it had been holding back, and now it was not. In engineering, Chief Okafor watched her readouts climb past every red line she had ever been taught to respect. Her hands moved across her console, feeding power, balancing loads, keeping the ship from tearing itself apart through sheer excess of force. "Captain," she said over the comm, "if we hold Protocol Thermopylae for more than 40 minutes, this ship will start taking structural damage that I cannot repair in the field. After 60 minutes, I cannot guarantee hull integrity." "Understood, Chief," Vasquez said. "Right, we will not need 60 minutes." The Dravani fleet closed in from every direction, and the sky above Valesra burned with the light of 340 warships converging on a single point. And at that single point, the Achilles waited for them, humming with power, its weapons hot, its hull shifting and adapting, its 4,000 drones reforming into attack swarms, and its AI thinking at the speed of war. One ship against everything. This was what it was built for. The Battle of Valesra lasted 38 minutes. It felt like a lifetime. When the full Dravani fleet converged on the Achilles, it did so with the kind of overwhelming force that was supposed to end battles before they began. 340 warships closing from every direction, their weapons hot, their shields at maximum, their captains hungry for the kill. From the outside, from the sensor screens of the Concord observers and the long-range telescopes of a dozen species, it looked like the end. The human ship was a single point of light surrounded by a closing sphere of fire. It should have been over in minutes. It was not over in minutes. Protocol Thermopylae was not a battle plan. It was a state of being. It pushed the Achilles past its limits and into a place that the engineers who designed it had called in their technical documents sustained operational excess. The crew had a simpler name for it. They called it the Red because when Protocol Thermopylae was active, every status display on the ship turned red. Not red as in danger. Red as in everything is running hotter, faster, and harder than it was ever meant to run. And the only question is whether the ship breaks the enemy before it breaks itself. The Achilles moved like nothing its size should have been able to move. The overclocked engines gave it an acceleration that made the Dravani targeting computer struggle. They had been programmed to predict the movement of capital ships, which moved slowly and ponderously. The Achilles did not move slowly. It cut through the converging fleet like a blade, changing direction with sudden, violent bursts of thrust that left streaks of superheated exhaust across the battlefield. Phalanx was the heart of it. The AI processed the battlefield at a speed that no organic mind could match. It saw every ship, every weapon, every missile, every drone, and every piece of debris simultaneously, and it made decisions about all of them in fractions of a second. It fired the Achilles beam arrays at targets that the human crew could not even see yet, hitting ships that were still turning to bring their weapons to bear. It launched missiles in patterns so complex that the Dravani point defense systems could not calculate interception solutions fast enough. It directed the drone swarms with a precision that made them seem less like machines and more like extensions of a single vast mind. And it prioritized. That was the crucial thing. Vasquez's orders had been clear. Break the blockade, protect the Valesi. Not destroy the fleet, not commit genocide. Break the blockade. Phalanx understood the difference, and it applied that understanding to every shot it fired. Engines, weapons, shield emitters, communications arrays. Phalanx targeted the systems that made ships dangerous, not the systems that kept crews alive. A Dravani battleship that lost its engines was no longer a threat. A cruiser that lost its weapons could not fight. A destroyer that lost its shields would withdraw rather than risk destruction. Ship after ship was crippled, disabled, rendered combat ineffective, and left to drift while the Achilles moved on to the next target. It was surgical, it was methodical, and it was relentless. In the first 10 minutes, the Achilles disabled 26 ships and destroyed 11 others that had positioned themselves too aggressively to allow for precision targeting. The drone swarms added another 15 disabled contacts. The Dravani formation, which had been a closing sphere of coordinated firepower, began to develop gaps as ships fell out of the fight. But the Dravani were not helpless. They were a species that had fought wars for centuries. They adapted. After the initial shock, the Dravani captains began to coordinate. They stopped trying to hit the Achilles with long-range fire, which the adaptive hull was negating with increasing efficiency, and began closing to point-blank range, where the sheer volume of fire would overwhelm any defense. They sent their own fighter squadrons to engage the drone swarms. They positioned their remaining heavy ships in tight clusters, creating overlapping fields of fire that even Phalanx had to respect. The Achilles started taking real damage. A concentrated volley from a Dravani battleship group struck the port side of the hull and overloaded the adaptive plating in that section. The armor, pushed beyond its capacity to restructure, simply failed. A section of the hull the size of a building peeled away and tumbled into space, venting atmosphere from 3 interior decks. Hull breach, decks 14 through 16, port side, Phalanx reported. Emergency bulkheads sealed. 17 crew members in affected sections. 12 confirmed evacuated. 5 unaccounted for. Vasquez's hands tightened on her chair. 5 people. 5 of her people. Possibly dead, possibly trapped in sealed compartments with no air. She pushed the thought down. She would mourn later. Right now she had a battle to fight. Redistribute hull plating to compensate, she ordered. Phalanx, adjust defensive priorities. Keep that side away from concentrated fire. Already done, Captain. And I have rotated our orientation to present the strongest remaining hull sections to the densest enemy formations. The battle continued. The Achilles pushed deeper into the Dravani fleet, heading for the siege line around Valesra. Every meter of progress was paid for in damage. A missile swarm overwhelmed the point defense on the starboard quarter and detonated against the hull, destroying a drone bay and the 600 autonomous craft still inside it. A Dravani destroyer rammed the Achilles forward section in a suicide attack, crumpling its own hull against the human ship's armor and taking a chunk of plating with it. On the bridge, a support beam broke loose from the ceiling and crashed down onto the navigation console. The navigator, Lieutenant Chen, was thrown from her seat. She hit the deck hard and did not get up. Her 2 crew members rushed to her side. The console was destroyed. Navigation is down, Park reported, his voice steady despite the blood running from a cut on his forehead. Phalanx, take over navigation, Vasquez said. Done, the AI replied. I have been running parallel navigation calculations since the battle began. There will be no loss of maneuvering capability. The minutes ground by. 15 minutes. 20. The Achilles was bleeding now. Fires burned in sections that the damage control teams could not reach. The spinal mount kinetic accelerator had been fired 4 more times, each shot cracking the formation of the fleet. But the barrel housing was showing stress fractures from the overclocking. Chief Okafor reported that the next firing might fuse the weapon permanently. 1 more shot, Vasquez said, to save it for when it matters. 25 minutes. The drone swarms were down to less than half their original numbers. The ones that remained fought with desperate ferocity, flinging themselves at Dravani ships in attacks that were as much about distraction as destruction. Phalanx managed them like a conductor managing an orchestra, pulling damaged drones back, pushing fresh ones forward, creating openings in the enemy formation that the Achilles could exploit. For 30 minutes, the Achilles had pushed through the second ring entirely and was now engaging the siege line, the ships closest to the planet. These ships had not been expecting a direct assault. They had been positioned to threaten the Velesi, not to fight a battle. When the Achilles came at them with its remaining weapons blazing and its hull burning, they scattered. Some of them did not scatter fast enough. Phalanx identified the ships that had their weapons aimed at the planet's surface and targeted them with specific priority. These were the ships that could kill millions with a single command. They had to be neutralized first. Beam arrays sliced through engine housings. Missiles found weapon ports. Drone swarms surrounded carriers and tore their fighter bays apart. 35 minutes. The siege line was broken. The Dravani ships closest to Valesra were drifting, disabled, their weapons silent. The path between the Achilles and the planet was clear, but the rest of the fleet was still fighting. On the Dravani flagship, Marshal Torek Vane stood before his tactical display and stared at the carnage. 98 of his ships were destroyed. Over 160 more were disabled or too damaged to fight effectively. The rest were still engaging, but their coordination was failing. Captains were making individual decisions, some pressing the attack, others pulling back to regroup. The fleet was no longer fighting as one. It was fighting as a collection of frightened, angry individuals, and the human ship was still moving. That was the thing that Vane could not get past. The Achilles was wounded. He could see it on his sensors. Sections of its hull were gone. Fires were visible on its surface. Its drone complement was reduced. Its energy output was fluctuating, which meant its power systems were strained. It was hurt. It was bleeding. It was burning. And it had not stopped. Not once. Not for a single second had it slowed down or turned away or shown any sign that it was considering retreat. It just kept coming, kept fighting, kept pushing forward, as if stopping was simply not something it was capable of doing. Vane had broken fleets before. He knew what it looked like when the fight went out of an enemy. He knew the moment when a ship's captain decided that survival was more important than victory, when the engines turned away and the weapons fell silent. He had seen it 100 times. He was not seeing it now. The Achilles was damaged beyond what any ship should be able to sustain and still function, and it was not running. It was heading for his flagship. He opened a private communication channel, encrypted, tight beam, so that only the Achilles would receive it. When he spoke, his voice was different than it had been at the start of the battle. The arrogance was gone. In its place was something that Vane had not felt in a very long time. "Human captain," he said, "what are you?" The response came after a moment. Vasquez's voice was hoarse. There was a noise in the background. Alarms, shouted orders, the groan of a ship under stress. When she appeared on the visual channel, Vane saw a woman with a gash on her forehead that was bleeding freely, standing on a bridge that was half lit by emergency lighting. Behind her, crew members worked frantically at damaged consoles. Sparks fell from a broken conduit in the ceiling. She looked like someone who was standing in the middle of a disaster. She sounded like someone who had already decided it did not matter. "And we are the species that looked at the dark between the stars and decided to walk into it anyway," she said. "We are the species that builds ships like this one because we know that someday, somewhere, someone is going to need help, and we might be the only ones willing to give it." She paused. When she spoke again, there was no anger in her voice, just a cold, clear certainty that hit harder than anger ever could. "You should not have touched people under our protection, Marshal." Vane stared at her through the screen. He had commanded fleets for 30 years. He had faced enemies that outnumbered him, outgunned him, and surprised him. He had always found a way to win because he understood the fundamental truth of warfare, that every enemy had a breaking point, and finding that point was the key to victory. He looked at Ria Vasquez, bleeding, battered, standing on the bridge of a dying ship, and he realized with a clarity that felt like cold water poured down his spine that this enemy did not have a breaking point. Not because they were inhuman, because they had decided somewhere in the depths of their strange, stubborn species that some things mattered more than survival, and they had built their entire military doctrine around that decision. The Achilles was not a weapon. It was a statement. It was the physical manifestation of a species that said, "We will not stand by. We will not look away. We will come for you, alone if we have to, and we will not stop until it is over." Vane looked at the tactical display. His fleet was shattered. The blockade was broken. The siege line was gone. Even if he could destroy the Achilles now, even if he threw every remaining ship at it and tore it apart, the mission had failed. The Valesi would survive. The Concorde had seen everything. The political consequences would be devastating. And if he continued fighting, more of his people would die. Many more. The human ship was wounded, but Phalanx was still coordinating its remaining weapons with lethal efficiency, and every minute the battle continued, more Dravani ships were being disabled or destroyed. He made the hardest decision of his career. It tasted like ash in his mouth. "All ships," Marshal Torek Vane said, and his voice was heavy with something that none of his officers had ever heard in it before. "All ships disengage. Full retreat. Fall back to Rally Point 7. Break off engagement immediately. The order rippled through the fleet, one by one, then in groups, and then in a flood. The Dravani ships turned away. Engines flared. Ships that had been firing on the Achilles moments ago now turned their sterns and accelerated out of the system. The siege-line ships, the ones still functional, pulled away from the planet. The heavy cruisers and battleships of the second ring broke formation and withdrew. The remaining ships of the shattered outer ring scattered into the dark. 340 ships had come to the Velesi system to enforce the will of the Dravani hegemony. Less than half of them were leaving under their own power. On the bridge of the Achilles, the silence was sudden and absolute. One moment, the ship was shaking with impacts, alarms were screaming, and the tactical display was a chaos of red markers. The next moment, the red markers were moving away. All of them. Moving away, accelerating, withdrawing. It took a moment for the crew to understand what was happening. Then it hit them. "They are retreating," Park said. His voice cracked on the last word. "Captain, they are retreating." Vasquez did not respond immediately. She sat in her command chair and watched the Dravani fleet pull away from Velesra, and she felt something that was too complicated to be called relief and too heavy to be called victory. She thought about the 5 crew members unaccounted for on decks 14 through 16. She thought about Lieutenant Chen, carried to the medical bay with a head injury. She thought about the fires still burning in the lower decks, and the hull breaches that were still being sealed, and the damage reports that were still coming in. They had won. It did not feel like winning was supposed to feel. "For a phalanx," she said quietly. "Move us into protective orbit above Velesra. Position us between the planet and the Dravani retreat vector. If any of them turn back, I want to know about it." "Understood, Captain. Moving to protective orbit now. I should note that 26 Dravani ships in our immediate vicinity are disabled and adrift. Their crews are alive but unable to maneuver. Standard protocol would suggest—" "Send a general broadcast on the Dravani emergency frequency," Vasquez said. "Tell them we will not fire on rescue ships. They can come collect their wounded." Park looked at her. Several officers on the bridge looked at her. She had just offered to let the enemy recover their disabled ships after a battle that had cost human lives. Vasquez met their looks with steady eyes. "We came here to break a blockade, not to kill people. The blockade is broken. The killing is done." On the surface of Velesra, the Velesi watched the sky change. The sensor readings that had shown 340 hostile contacts surrounding their world began to clear. One by one, then in groups, the red markers on their defense screens disappeared as the Dravani ships withdrew. In their place, a single contact moved into a slow, steady orbit above the planet. A single ship, scarred and battered and burning in places, but alive, still there, still between them and anything that might try to hurt them. Ambassador Lise stood in the High Council chamber and watched the orbital display. The atmospheric generators, which had been counting down toward failure, still had fuel for 4 more days. Enough time for supply ships to arrive now that the blockade was gone. Her people were going to live. She pressed her hands against the display and wept. The other council members wept with her. Elder Tesavri, the oldest among them, looked at the single contact on the display, the one ship that had come when no one else would, and said a word in the old Velesi language that had not been spoken in generations. It was a word that meant something close to shield-bearer, someone who stands between the helpless and the harm. On Orventhal Prime, the Concord observation chamber was silent for a long time after the battle ended. The representatives of 12 species sat in their seats and stared at their screens and tried to process what they had just seen. One ship, one human ship had broken a blockade of 340 warships. It had done it in 38 minutes. It had done it while taking damage that would have destroyed any other vessel in the known galaxy. And it had done it while showing restraint, targeting engines and weapons rather than reactors and crew quarters, disabling rather than destroying wherever possible, and then offering to let the enemy rescue their wounded after the fighting was over. The Kirathi military attaché, Torvan, was the first to move. He reached for his communication console and typed a message to the Kirathi High Command. It was a message that no Karathi officer had sent in 400 years, a formal request for a military alliance with another species. The Karathi did not ask for allies. They did not need allies. They had not needed allies since before most species in the conquered had achieved spaceflight. But Torvan had just watched something that changed his understanding of what was possible, and he was smart enough to know that being allies with the species that built the Achilles was better than the alternative. The Orvan analyst sat beside him, still staring at its data. It had run the numbers 17 times. Each time, the result was the same. The performance of the Achilles exceeded every model the Orvan had for what a single ship could do. The models were not wrong. The data was not wrong. The Orvan's understanding of the universe had simply been incomplete. It turned to the Thesic representative, who had been silent and motionless throughout the entire battle. "This changes everything," the analyst said. The Thesic representative, for the first time in the entire crisis, spoke. "Yes," it said. It does." The analyst looked back at its data one more time. Then, in a quiet voice meant for no one in particular, it said the thing that everyone in the room was thinking. The thing that would be repeated in 100 languages across 1,000 worlds in the days to come. They sent one ship because one ship was a warning. If they had sent a fleet, it would have been a declaration. The words hung in the air like smoke. Nobody disagreed. In orbit above Valesra, the Achilles turned slowly in the starlight, its scarred hull catching the glow of the Valesi sun. Fires still burned in its wounded sections. Repair crews worked in the blackness of space, sealing breaches, welding plates, pulling debris from the hull. Inside, the medical bays were full. Damage control teams fought fires and repaired systems that had been pushed past their breaking point. Captain Vasquez walked the corridors of her ship and looked at her crew. They were exhausted. Many were wounded. Some were missing. The count was still coming in, but she knew that not everyone had survived. She stopped at a viewport and looked down at the planet below. It was beautiful, blue and white, with crystal mountains that caught the light. It was alive. It was going to stay alive. That mattered. That had to matter enough. She pressed her hand against the viewport and whispered a number. 31. That was how many crew members the Achilles had lost. 31 people who had come to save a world and would not be going home. She would remember every name. She would make sure the galaxy remembered why they died. Well, the UES Achilles came home on a Tuesday. It limped through the Sol system at a fraction of its normal speed, its engines running on reduced power, its hull patched with emergency plating that looked like bandages on a wounded animal. Sections of its outer armor were simply gone, stripped away by Dravani fire, and replaced with temporary seals that glowed faintly with the blue light of emergency force fields. Scorch marks ran along its flanks in long, dark streaks. One of its drone bays was a blackened crater. The spinal mount kinetic accelerator was fused shut, its barrel housing warped from the stress of overuse. It was the most beautiful thing anyone in the solar system had ever seen. They came out to meet it. Thousands of ships, civilian transports, private yachts, commercial freighters, orbital shuttles, while even a few fishing boats from the lunar colonies that had no business being in deep space but had come anyway. They formed a corridor of light and metal that stretched from the outer marker buoy to Earth's orbital dock, and as the Achilles passed between them, they turned on every light they had. Running lights, cabin lights, headlights, signal lamps. The corridor blazed like a highway made of stars. Inside the civilian ships, people pressed against viewports and stared at the Achilles as it passed. Some of them cheered, some of them cried. Many of them held up handwritten signs that the crew of the Achilles could not possibly read from that distance, but it did not matter. The gesture was the thing. "Welcome home. Thank you. You are not forgotten." The news drones swarmed around the ship like insects, their cameras broadcasting every angle to every screen on Earth and every human colony in the solar system. The images they captured would become some of the most famous photographs in human history. The battered hull of the Achilles, scarred and burned and broken in places, moving slowly through a sea of civilian lights, coming home from the fight that changed everything. Captain Ria Vasquez stood on the outer hull for the arrival. This was an old naval tradition that had been carried from the oceans of Earth to the darkness of space. the captain standing on the deck as the ship entered port. She wore her full-dress uniform, pressed and clean, a sharp contrast to the damaged hull beneath her boots. The magnetic clamps in her boots held her to the surface as the ship moved, and the thin energy field of her suit kept her alive in the vacuum. She stood at attention and saluted. Not the civilian fleet, not the cameras, not the cheering crowds watching on their screens back on Earth. She saluted the 31 crew members who were not standing beside her, the 31 who had gone to save a world and had given everything they had, including their lives. Their names were displayed on the Achilles main communication screen, visible to every ship in the corridor, scrolling slowly in white text against a black background. Ensign Maria Torres, Petty Officer 2nd Class James Wukong, Lieutenant Sarah Osei, Chief Warrant Officer Pavel Morozov. The names went on. 31 names. 31 people who would never see Earth again. The corridor of civilian ships went quiet as the names scrolled past. The cheering stopped. The lights stayed on, but the voices fell silent. It was, for a moment, a corridor of mourning as much as a corridor of welcome. And that was exactly right, because you could not separate the two. The victory and the cost, the pride and the grief. They were the same thing. The Achilles docked at Earth's primary orbital station, and the crew disembarked into the arms of their families, their friends, and a world that could not stop saying thank you. 3 months passed. The galaxy changed. At the Galactic Concord, the session that reconvened to discuss the aftermath of the Valesi crisis was very different from the one that had preceded it. The same species sat in the same seats in the same great chamber on Orventhal Prime, but the atmosphere was unrecognizable. The casual condescension that the major powers had once directed at humanity was gone, replaced by something more complicated. Respect, certainly, but also wariness, and in some cases, fear. Humanity's file in the Concord database had been updated. The old designation, developmental species, had been quietly removed. In its place was a new classification that had been created specifically for them, because no existing category fit. The new designation was Apex Singular Threat. The definition, written by a committee of military analysts from 6 species, was precise and clinical. A species possessing the capability to deploy a single asset that constitutes a strategic-level threat to established military powers. The definition was accurate. It was also, several species noted privately, terrifying, because it did not say, the Achilles constitutes a strategic-level threat. It said a single asset. 1. The implication was clear. If the humans could build one ship like the Achilles, they could build more. And the fact that they had kept it secret for years, that no one in the galaxy had known it existed until the moment it was needed, raised a question that made intelligence agencies across the galaxy very uncomfortable. What else were the humans hiding? Commander Jonah Marin addressed the Concord for the first time as a full representative, not a junior liaison. Earth had been elevated to a senior seat, a position that normally required decades of membership and significant political maneuvering. Humanity had earned it in 38 minutes. Jonah stood on the central platform where Ambassador Lee Say had stood 3 months ago, begging for help. He looked out at the same chamber, the same curved rows of seats, the same representatives who had voted to let the Valesi die. He had prepared a speech. He had revised it 11 times. In the end, he threw out the prepared version and spoke from memory, because what he wanted to say was too important to read from a screen. 11 years ago, Jonah said, humanity joined this Concord because we believed in collective security. We believed that the purpose of this alliance was to protect the species within it, to stand together against aggression, and to ensure that no people would be left to face destruction alone. He paused. The chamber was very quiet. 3 months ago, we watched every species in this chamber vote to let an innocent world die. We sat in this room and listened to calculations about acceptable losses. We heard strategic assessments that concluded the Valesi were not worth saving. We watched the most powerful civilizations in the galaxy look at a helpless people and decide that helping them was too expensive, too risky, too inconvenient. His voice did not rise. It did not need to. So we sent one ship. We sent one ship because that is what it took. Because we looked at the situation and decided that if no one else was willing to do the right thing, we would do it ourselves, even if it cost us everything. 31 of our people died doing what this entire Concorde should have done together. He looked around the chamber, meeting eyes, meeting the equivalent of eyes, meeting the gazes of species that had sat in these seats and done nothing, while the Valesi counted down the days until their air ran out. We did not send the Achilles to prove a point. We sent it because people were going to die, and we could not accept that. But I will not pretend that no point was proven. A point was proven, and the point is this. He straightened up. We hope sincerely that next time there is a crisis, we will not have to send a ship at all, because next time you will do the right thing yourselves. Not because you are afraid of us, not because you have seen what our ships can do, but because you remember what it felt like to sit in this chamber and do nothing, and you decide that you never want to feel that way again. The silence that followed was long and uncomfortable. Nobody applauded, nobody objected. They sat with his words the way one sits with a truth that is painful but impossible to deny. In the months that followed, the political landscape of the galaxy shifted in ways that analysts would spend years trying to fully understand. 7 species formally requested military alliances with Earth. The Karathi were first, their request filed during the battle itself by Attaché Torvan, who had seen enough to know that the galaxy had changed and that the Karathi needed to change with it. The others followed quickly. The Valesi, naturally, but also the Thessic Collective, which broke its long tradition of neutrality, and 4 smaller species that had been watching from the margins and had drawn their own conclusions. The Dravani hegemony, which had ruled its corner of the galaxy through intimidation and raw military power for generations, began to fracture. Marshal Torek Vane was recalled to the hegemony capital to face a council of inquiry. The details of the inquiry were not made public, but the result was Vane was stripped of his rank and sent to a remote garrison post on the edge of Dravani space. He did not protest. He had seen the human ship. He had spoken to its captain. He understood in a way that the politicians back home did not yet understand, that the hegemony's way of doing things was no longer sustainable in a galaxy that contained humanity. The fracturing was slow but steady. 3 Dravani client states declared independence within the first month, emboldened by the demonstration that the hegemony could be beaten. 2 more followed in the second month. Whilst the hegemony's response was muted, they did not have the fleet strength to enforce compliance after losing so many ships at Valesra, and more importantly, they were afraid. Not of the rebels, of what might happen if they tried to crush the rebels and another human ship appeared in their skies. The Valesi became a symbol. Their homeworld, which had been days from death, became the focal point of a new principle in galactic law. It was called the Valesi Doctrine, and it was proposed by the Thessic Collective, which had remained silent during the original crisis and seemed determined to make up for that silence now. The doctrine was simple. No species may be blockaded, besieged, or subjected to military coercion without the immediate and collective response of the Galactic Concorde. If the Concorde failed to respond, any member species had the legal authority to intervene independently. The doctrine passed with the largest majority vote in Concorde history. Every species voted in favor except the Dravani, who abstained. Ambassador Lysay of the Valesi was present for the vote. She sat in the Valesi delegation seat, which had been moved from the back of the chamber to a position of honor near the center, and she watched the votes come in with the quiet, steady expression of someone who had been through the worst and come out the other side. When the result was announced, she did not cheer. She simply nodded once and looked toward the human delegation. Jonah Marin nodded back. On Earth, the Achilles sat in its orbital dock and underwent repairs that would take the better part of a year. The damage was extensive. As the adaptive hull plating needed to be completely replaced across 60% of the ship's surface, the spinal mount accelerator was removed and rebuilt from scratch. 2 of the 4 drone bays were replaced entirely. Structural members throughout the ship's interior were reinforced or replaced where protocol thermopylae had pushed them past their tolerances. The crew was given leave, extended leave, the kind that came with a suggestion from the Admiralty that they spend some of it talking to professionals about what they had been through. Many of them did. Some of them did not need to. Some of them needed to but did not, because they were stubborn, and stubbornness was a trait that the Achilles seemed to select for in its crew. Captain Vasquez spent her leave on Earth in a small house in the mountains of Peru that had belonged to her grandmother. She did not give interviews. She did not attend ceremonies. She did not accept the 17 invitations to speak at military academies, universities, and government events. She sat on her grandmother's porch and looked at the mountains and thought about the 31 people she had lost and the millions she had saved. And she tried to find a way to hold both of those things in her mind at the same time without breaking. She succeeded eventually. She was, after all, the kind of person who commanded a ship like the Achilles. Breaking was not something she did easily. Phalanx was updated during the repairs. The AI's combat algorithms were refined based on the data from the battle. Its processing architecture was expanded. And several new tactical modules were added. When the technicians reactivated the system after the updates, Phalanx's first words were, "Has the crew been well cared for in my absence?" The chief technician, who had been working on AIS for 20 years and thought she was past being surprised by them, found that she had to take a moment before she could answer. "Yes," she said, "they have." "Good," Phalanx said. "Then I am ready to resume my duties." Across the galaxy, the story of the Achilles spread. It was told in 100 different ways by 100 different species. Some told it as a military story, focusing on the technology, the tactics, and the sheer improbability of one ship defeating 340. Some told it as a political story, about the failure of the Concorde and the consequences of inaction. Some told it as a moral story, about a species that chose to risk everything for people it had never met. The Valesi told it as a story of salvation. The Karathi told it as a story of respect. The Orvan told it as a statistical anomaly that required fundamental revision of their models. The Dravani told it as a warning. On a neutral station far from the centers of galactic power, 6 months after the battle, a young Dravani officer sat in a bar and stared into his drink. His name was Koran Vesh, and he had been a junior weapons officer on one of the destroyers in the Outer Ring. His ship had been one of the first disabled in the battle. Its engines had been cut apart by beam fire so precise that the engineering section did not even lose pressure. One moment they were fighting. The next they were drifting, alive but powerless, and watching the rest of the battle unfold on passive sensors. He had nightmares about it. Not about the danger, about the precision, about the cold, systematic efficiency with which the Achilles had taken his ship apart. It had not been angry. It had not been cruel. It had simply decided that his ship was no longer going to be a problem, and then it had made that decision real with a few seconds of perfectly aimed fire. A human sat down on the stool beside him. She was a Marine, based on the insignia on her jacket. Master Sergeant Diane Okonkwo, according to her name tag. She was a broad-shouldered woman with kind eyes and a face that looked like it smiled easily, though she was not smiling now. She ordered a drink, took a sip, and sat in companionable silence for a while. Koran looked at her. He knew she was human. She knew he was Dravani. In the months since the battle, encounters like this had become common on neutral stations. Former enemies sharing a bar, sharing a drink, trying to figure out what came next. There was no hostility in it. The war, such as it was over. What remained was the aftermath, and the aftermath was complicated. "Can I ask you something?" Koran said. "Sure." "Why just one ship? Truly. Not the political answer. Not the diplomatic answer. The real answer. Why did your people send one ship against our entire fleet instead of bringing everything you had?" Diane took a drink. She set the glass down and looked at him with those kind, steady eyes. "Because sending a fleet says we want to win," she said. "Sending one ship says we do not even need to try." She paused and then added, more quietly, "And that is the part that keeps you up at night, is it not?" Koran stared at his drink for a long time. The bar was noisy around them. Laughter, music, the clinking of glasses. But in the small space between the two of them, there was only silence and the weight of a truth that he had been carrying since the battle and could not put down. "Yes," he said, "it is." Diane nodded. She did not gloat. She did not press the point. She simply sat beside a former enemy and drank her drink and let the silence be what it was. After a while, Koran spoke again. "Your ship, the Achilles, It could have destroyed us. All of us. It targeted engines and weapons instead. It offered to let our rescue ships collect our wounded. Why? Diane looked at him. Because we were not there to destroy you. We were there to stop you. And there is a difference. Most species do not seem to understand that, but we do. You stop the threat. You do not burn the world. That is not who we are. Karan thought about that for a long time. Then he finished his drink, set the glass down, and stood up. I think, he said carefully, that my people made a very large mistake when they decided to test yours. Diane almost smiled. I think you might be right. He nodded to her and walked away. She watched him go, then turned back to the bar and ordered another drink. Deep in Earth's orbital shipyards behind the asteroid belt where Jupiter's gravity hid the construction platforms from casual observation, work had begun on a new ship. It was not a secret exactly. The Concorde knew about it. The intelligence agencies of a dozen species had detected the construction activity and had filed reports about it. But their reports contained very little detail because the shipyard security was extraordinary and the humans were very good at keeping things hidden when they wanted to. The ship's designation was UES Marathon. It was Siege class. Hull number 2. The Marathon was not a copy of the Achilles. It was an evolution. Every lesson learned from the Battle of Valesra was being incorporated into its design. The adaptive hull plating was faster, able to restructure in half the time. The spinal mount was reinforced to sustain repeated firings without structural damage. The drone bays were larger, the engines were more powerful. And the AI core was built on an expanded architecture that would make the Marathon's version of Phalanx even faster and more capable than the original. The construction crews worked around the clock. They were volunteers, every one of them. There was a waiting list to work on the Marathon that stretched for months. People wanted to be part of it. They wanted to help build the next chapter of the story that the Achilles had started. In the Concorde's intelligence networks, a routine surveillance system detected the construction activity and generated an automated report. The report was flagged, categorized, and distributed to the intelligence agencies of every major species. It contained a single line of data that, despite its brevity, caused a remarkable amount of quiet concern across the galaxy. When the line read, "Humanity is building another one." In her office at the Karathi Intelligence Division, analyst Sarath Voss read the report and added it to her growing file on human military capabilities. The file had grown considerably since the battle. She had spent months trying to understand the Achilles, and she was still not sure she fully grasped what she was looking at. The humans had hidden the most powerful warship in the galaxy inside an asteroid belt for years, and nobody had noticed. Now they were building a second one, and they were not even trying to hide it. She sat back in her chair and thought about what that meant. Hiding the first ship made sense. It was a surprise, a secret weapon, held in reserve until the moment it was needed. But building the second one openly, that was different. That was not a secret. And that was a message. The message was the Achilles was not unique. It was not a miracle. It was not a one-time thing. It was the beginning. Sarath added a note to her file. It said, "Recommend continued alliance with Earth. Recommend not testing their resolve again. Recommend not giving them a reason to build a third one." She closed the file and looked out her window at the stars. Somewhere out there, in the dark between those stars, humanity was building. They were building ships and alliances and a reputation that would echo across the galaxy for generations. They were building a future in which the strong could not prey on the weak without consequence, in which a single ship could change the course of history, and in which the species that looked at the dark and chose to walk into it anyway would never, ever stand by while innocent people died. They had sent one ship, it had been enough. But just in case the galaxy forgot that lesson, they were building another one. And somewhere in a small house in the mountains of Peru, Captain Ria Vasquez sat on her grandmother's porch and watched the sun set behind the Andes. Her communicator buzzed. She looked at it. A message from Admiral Wu. "Ria, when you are ready, the Marathon needs a captain. No rush, take your time. But when you are ready, she is yours." Vasquez looked at the message for a long time. She looked at the mountains, golden in the fading light. She thought about the 31 names she carried with her. She thought about the Valesi child who had watched the sky and hoped. She typed her response. Now I am ready. She set down the communicator and watched the last of the sunlight fade from the peaks. Tomorrow she would go back to the stars. Tomorrow she would stand on the bridge of a new ship and look out at the galaxy that had learned, the hard way, what humanity was capable of. But tonight, she sat in the mountains and watched the dark come in, and she was not afraid of it. She had never been afraid of the dark. None of them had. That was the point.